everybody. Welcome back. We're here now for a panel on exploring urgent challenges of global urban growth. My name is Sara Smiley-Smith. I'm an assistant dean for academic affairs, research, and sustainability here at the Forestry School, and I'm happy to be here to serve as the moderator for this panel. I expect we're going to have an exciting conversation. I'm going to briefly introduce our three Yale faculty panelists, but you can find their full bios in your program for today. So first, we have Professor Mushfiq Mubarak, who's a professor of economics with appointments in both the School of Management and the Department of Economics. Professor Mubarak's work explores strategies for inducing people in developing countries to adopt technologies or behaviors to improve their welfare. Very brief summary of your work. Next, we have Professor Karen Seto. She's a professor of geography and urbanization science here at FNES. And her work explores urbanization and global change, urban mitigation of climate change, and satellite remote sensing. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Albert Coe. Dr. Coe is the department chair and professor of microbial disease epidemiology at the School of Public Health. He's also a professor of medicine, where his focus is on infectious disease. Dr. Coe's research focuses on health problems that have emerged as a consequence of rapid urbanization and social inequity. Thank you all for being here. So my plan for the next hour and a half together is to move through a series of questions where I'll ask all of our panelists to keep their responses brief. We're going to try to have a conversational panel for you all, and I'll do my best to encourage that dialogue between them. After about 45 minutes, we'll open it up to you all, so I'd like to encourage you as we go along to be thinking of questions, specifically questions that we can pose to the whole panel, again, to keep the conversation flowing among them. So just be ruminating on what those questions might be as we move ahead. So to kick us off, I think it's probably already been said today that according to the United Nations, by 2050, we'll have 2.5 billion more people living in urban areas, with 90% of that growth taking place in Africa and Asia. From your perspectives, what is the most critical challenge we'll face because of this rapid urbanization? Would anyone like to take that one to start?
You know, I'll start with something, which is that it's understandable that we are starting the panel by talking about challenges, but I just want to make sure that everybody understands what a huge opportunity that is as well. Like before we delve into challenges, which maybe the most of the panel will be about. Cities are the most productive places on Earth. This is where people should be living. It's also the most environmentally friendly way to live, in that if you have dense urban settlements, we take up less of the earth, right? If you have to make room for 7 billion or 8 billion people, right, it'll be better if we do it with less of the earth being used. And cities, it's one of the greatest inventions in history because it's the place where people come together, there's an exchange of ideas that generates productivity. So if you look across the world, both in poor and in rich countries, right, and you look within countries, in rural areas versus urban areas, so macroeconomists have documented that there's about a 300% gap in productivity and wages between urban and rural areas within countries, right? And that also, that's the opportunity, right? And so that makes us think. I'm a development economist, which means that I think about why is it that some countries are poor, others are rich, and what can we do about the fact that these countries are poor? And one set of reasons we think about are misallocation. Are there ways in which resources are misallocated? Is capital not being put to its right uses? Is labor not being put to its right uses, right? And one form of misallocation that seems to matter a lot is that people, especially in poor countries, they seem to be inefficiently spatially allocated, right? That they're stuck in these very unproductive places, whereas, if you were to move to cities within the same countries, you'd be 3 times as productive. You'd earn 3 times as much, right? And that also poses a big challenge for us. The challenge is not just the way you just phrased it, which is how do we address the challenges that cities pose, but also how do we get people into cities, right? Why is it that they're stuck in the wrong places?
I would say the spatial misallocation of what you mentioned is not limited to poor countries, though, because clearly we're hearing that from the last panel that's a problem here in this country. I would say the biggest challenge in the next 30 years is how those 2.5 billion people will be configured in cities. So it is really an issue of land use. So any of my students from my class can tell you all the ways in which the configuration of land use is linked to everything from the energy used for transportation, to energy used for buildings, to issues around mental health, creation of urban heat island, flooding. All of that starts from how cities are configured. I will say that I know nothing about planning. And I invited Tina Rosen here to hopefully give us some positive images of planning. And I learned at the lunchtime talk that in fact, you all don't have it figured out. So I think that is the biggest challenge is as scientists, we do these projections, we then say, okay, things have to get fixed. And I, this whole time, thought that you all, I'm looking at the planners, would know what to do. So I think now I might have to change my pitch. But the biggest challenge is we need to figure out how planners, designers, developers, like configure the land, because I think we have the science. We know what we need to do. I keep looking at the two of you. We know from the science perspective what needs to be done.
Okay, so my comments will resonate both with Karen and Mushfiq's, but I think the critical challenge really relates to the discussion which was in the earlier session in the morning, which is the issue of inequity. And I'm going to talk about just specifically in the realm of public health. As Mushfiq said, living in cities is associated with better health outcomes. We have lower birth rates, we have decreased death rates, we have people not working with, not subject to these poverty-promoting diseases, these neglected diseases, and there's a shift in the burden of disease. However, living in cities, as was illustrated very nicely in this morning, the captivating kind of discussions, is really grounded in the issue of inequities. And with urban living opposed to rural living, opposed to bigger divides between rich and poor. And that's where we have an opportunity for intervention. And that opportunity of intervention is that better access. And I'm talking particularly of health, specifically of health, but it could extend to education and sanitation and so forth. We have an opportunity to act on. The question is, what's the right paradigm? And the challenge is inequity. The second challenge would be, what's the paradigm we use? We can't use the paradigm of the sanitation revolution and having the urban, the street grids. That won't work in Hosinya, in Rio de Janeiro or Kibera in Nairobi. So we are going to have to find the right formula of technical, financial, governance, and really civil society, how we're going to configure civil society to come up with that new paradigm. And I'm looking at the paradigm planners, but I'm also looking at Karen to come up and Mushfiq to come up with those solutions.
And I think that there are very different challenges for places that don't have the governance and institutions, right? So you just mentioned Kibera, Rio de Janeiro, all places in the global south that don't have the same kind of governance and institutions in place. Again, I'm just surprised to hear that we can't fix things here so easily in the US, where we do have governance and institutions. So I think the challenges will be very, very different. Yeah, as well as the technology that's available and financing.
Right. And so one size doesn't fit all. Governance means something very, very different if you're in a place like Brazil, which has actually a structural or a constitutional framework for community participation, but doesn't implement it, versus another place which doesn't have a guarantee to social rights, and particularly social rights for squatters and slum settlements.
Mushfiq, you look like you might be preparing something you want to rebut here.
No, I'm not rebutting. I was just thinking when you were...
We should fight like the first
when,
But
when you were talking about, cities make people healthier, et cetera, the thing that came to my mind, maybe it's happened just as people also start voting better when they move to cities, right? That's another good reason too.
So maybe to go to where Mushfiq actually started us off here in thinking about some of the solutions. So we've identified a fair number of the challenges now that we face in thinking about this rapid urbanization. If you had to crystallize, I would give you three, but I think that might take up too much time. So let's say just two two key solutions. What are the two things that if you had a magic wand, you would move ahead on right now?
Actually, I'll do three. But I'll do them quickly. So this is just a follow-on from my earlier comments about, cities are places of opportunity. This is where we should be figuring out how to move more people into, right? So what I'm trying to say is that, okay, why are cities places of opportunities? There's greater mixing, there's agglomeration benefits from mixing of ideas, and people make each other productive, et cetera. So you want to let that happen. But on the other hand, this greater mixing also poses all these challenges we were talking about, right? In Kibera, in Hosinya, you have people living in dense settlements, maybe not so much in Hosinya, but in many cities in South Asia, right? And that interaction leads to disease, the very reason why Karen's sitting farther away from Albert.
He is ill. He's not diseased. He's ill.
So we want to somehow maximize those positive externalities and the interaction benefits, and minimize those negative ones. That's how we want to make cities work well, right? Now, okay. So what are the constraints that are preventing people from accessing these very productive places? So the three things that we might want to think about is, one is housing restrictions, right? So that makes cities very, very expensive places, right? And you see why this happens. In many places, it's NIMBYism, right? I don't want more people around me. I don't want to have people too close to me. I want to be exclusive, et cetera, right? But we need to do something about housing restrictions. So this morning, we heard a lot about San Francisco, right? And I think the big overarching problem in San Francisco is that we've made it insanely expensive just by not allowing people to build. That's all artificial, right? We're making those choices, right? There's a homelessness problem. That's a choice that we're making for a place like San Francisco. Even New York, I think, can expand more, right? The places that are productive, we want to expand. All right, so now if there are some limits to housing, what else can you do? You could, the other restriction that might be keeping people from cities is not allowing people to commute in, okay? So this is a great example where we're sitting, where the equivalent distance from, say, New Haven to New York, right? If we were to look in Germany, that's the same commuting zone, right? And there are ways that people can get to, or in Japan, right? There are ways that people can reasonably get to Tokyo from a distance that's as far as New Haven to New York, or get to Frankfurt that's at that same distance. But somehow we're not making that happen, right? So recently I had to come back from Boston to New Haven, and I was online checking at the same time. The price of one Acela train ticket from Boston to New Haven was more expensive than just taking an Uber. Okay? That's insane, right? And I had 3 people traveling with me, so the choice was obvious. It was also faster. I mean, the fact that the car is faster than a train is also kind of insane. Okay? And the other thing that's insane here is, I mean, most of you won't know or remember this, but about 15, 20 years ago, it was faster to get from New Haven to New York than it is today. It used to take 1.5 hours flat. Right? It's just gotten slower and slower. Okay? And at the same time, locations that's like twice the distance, China is covering that in 30 minutes. Okay? All right, so that's the second friction. And the third issue is maybe migration restrictions. Right? So governments have often viewed migrants into cities as some kind of an invasion to repel. Right? And that's how, so I actually, when you were describing my work as encouraging people to do things that are good for them, like one of the things I encourage people to do is to get them to move to cities. Right? So I run experiments trying to get them to go to places where they would earn more money. Right? And when I talk to governments around the world about, scaling up this program, their general reaction is, oh, we've been always trying to get people out of cities. Right? So this doesn't make sense for us. So those are the 3 restrictions I would work on: housing, commuting, which is about public transport, and migration restrictions.
I have just one.
Okay.
One thing. So this may not be very popular, but I would say if we're going to, so we're in an environment school, if we are going to preserve the ecosystems of the planet, the lungs of the planet, and we know that the configuration of land use is one of the big issues around whether it's inequity or greenhouse gas emissions. What if we said we would not build any more new urban land beyond the existing footprint? What if we just said that as a mind experiment? How would we configure our cities going into the future? I think that that's possible. I think budgets are good in so many different ways. You know, financial budgets are good, time budgets are good. Constraints, I mean, you're an economist, right? Constraints help us be more efficient, more productive. And the fact that we see land as nearly infinite, or developers see land as infinite, means that we're very inefficient with how we configure space. But if we actually said, okay, this is all the land we have, how do we redevelop the land that we already currently have? I think that we would probably make very different choices going into the future about how we would house the additional 2.5 billion people. It doesn't mean that we need to build only high rises. So that's a myth. That's a huge myth, that the only way to get lots of people in one place is lots of high rises. The challenge is not about, I mean, part of the challenge is increasing population density, but the bigger challenge is how do we have co-location of increased population density, so where people live, near where people work and where they recreate. So it's not enough simply to have lots of people here, but then they have to commute really far to work there or recreate here. We actually want them co-located in some way. So I think that if we had some land constraints, significant ones, it would completely change how we build and rebuild going into the future.
So can I rebut Karen, but still have my 3?
I think we can allow that. We still have enough time, right? Okay.
No, so Karen makes a good point. I'm just trying to get my head around how you're going to, I mean, there have been a long history of land constraints that have been done, in particularly in the context of rural to urban migration, that we have a lot of failures in that. But going back, I think the devil's in the details. So much of the...
That's why I'm explaining the planners to fix it.
Yeah, it wasn't very satisfying this morning, right? But I think the issue is that, you know, so not all urbanization is going to be the same. Yeah. And much of the growth are not going to be in the mega cities. They're going to be in small or mid-sized cities. So, you know, just as a quick thing, I'll go into my 3, but I would think that that those land constraints will mean very, very different things depending on where you are or what country you're at, and what the size of the city and what kind of migration. So again, I don't see that as necessarily as the big thing. There's probably a lot of heterogeneity in how that would be rolled out. So let me get to my 3, and I'm a little bit of a hedgehog on this sense. So I'm going to go back to the issue of inequities, and which I think, and when this plays out, when we think about like Johannesburg or Pretoria or Rio de Janeiro, or the city I lived in Salvador, Brazil, it's really this issue of security, right? And you know, the interplay of security and civil society and structure. So I think the three things that I'd like to see is, one is that we're trapped in this argument of externalities. Everything we have to justify is how those how improvement in health or education or social rights of marginalized slum dwellers have to be placed in the context of the whole society. And that doesn't get at the root of marginalization. And that's the underlying issue of externalities, whether it's within cities or within countries or between countries. The second is, I think one effective way to approach that is structural implementation of social rights. And I think Brazil is a good example of how that could work and how that may not work that well. But I think structural, not only policies, but law in ensuring social rights is one issue to deal with externalities. And this may get an argument from Mushfiq on that. The third part is that I don't think we have all the answers in research. And this is where we can't always blame it on the planners. And I don't think we really have the good evidence. And I'm looking at, I think, Karen, this is what we're looking for you at Yale to help us answer this issue. But you know, what is that balance between what was discussed as urban form, but the technical side versus the financial, the governance, and that I don't think we have that. And I don't think we have also the capacity or the research capacity to understand what is good, what works and what doesn't work. And I think, you know, and this is coming from somebody who's a physician and an epidemiologist. We don't have, and I think this is where some of the studies that Mushfiq has been doing, and with IPA and in Bangladesh are really important. How do we get that hard evidence to tell the planners what works and doesn't work? And I don't think we have gotten that right as of yet. So those are my three wish lists. But
So I don't know, I agree that we don't have all the science. We don't know all the science, but we know enough. And so we don't know what are the optimal ways to lay out a city so to have economic development, inequality, reduced emissions, and lower health burdens, right? So we don't know, we haven't optimized that equation yet, those sets of equations yet. But we do know how to avoid worst case scenarios in all of those cases, right? And so I would say that we don't have the luxury to wait until we have the perfect science to build the perfect city. So we just, in my lab, published a paper that's coming out very soon that forecasts the growth of cities worldwide going out to 2050. And the new estimates, this is going to be published very soon, shows that we're going to build a city about the physical size of New York every 8 days, somewhere on the planet. So the plane's already taken off in some ways, and we can't...
Or it's passed.
Right, and so we can't wait for the perfect set of solutions. We have to start implementing or experimenting with what we know now. Otherwise, we're going to be in a situation that we are in now, which is we build business as usual, we know this doesn't work, and then we say, oh, how do we fix it afterwards? How do we make it more walkable or accessible? Or, I mean, it seems like from today's morning panel and the keynotes that we've developed these systems that cause lots of congestion because we need 8 squares and planning doesn't work. So we need to just do something different immediately.
I also have a problem with Karen's thought experiment.
So we made an agreement beforehand to gang up on you, Karen.
And that is, no, but I understand the problem you're trying to solve. So you don't want places like Houston and Dallas. They're like the worst places. No, places outside of Houston and Dallas. So when the city grows out and it's massive sprawl, right? So that's what you're trying to, that's the type of problem you're trying to address. But if you actually go through with a thought experiment like that, where you're restricting the boundaries of a city without thinking about, okay, why are people moving in there? How many people need to move in there? Who needs to live there, right? Then the unintended consequence of that might be that you might be pushing people to remain in rural areas and not in the outskirts of cities. So you might actually get an even worse outcome than having
Well,
a
I'll
better
give you
city.
that, and I'll give you that, and I'll say with all budgets, there's always a little bit of wiggle room, right? But I think the problem now is that it's too much of a free-for-all because we have almost no constraints.
Yeah, I mean, what I see and this is much more in developing countries, I would say, is that there is a massive anti-urban bias in policymaking, and that's something that needs to be rebalanced. And it comes from 2 places. So one is that policymakers are rightly concerned about, okay, where are the poor people and how do we help them, right? How do we help poor people? And so when you start asking, okay, how do we help poor people, right? Then you're, one way you phrase the question that's a little bit lazy is, oh, let's look at where they are and let's help them there. So let's do rural development programs, right? But the fact that the poor people are in rural areas right now, that's not a fundamental condition of their being. It's not like they always have to be there, right? So like development should really be like person-based as opposed to place-based. So then when you do rural development, that distorts decisions, keeps people in the wrong places. And then the other problem I see is that policymakers who live in cities, right, they think of, oh, these migrants who come into these cities, they're like, people who are dirtying up my city, and I don't want them here, right? But the fact that they're, they might be starving for part of the year, or their children aren't getting adequate nutrition for part of the year, that's a much, that's a order of magnitude bigger problem, but that's not as salient for them.
It strikes me that we've already brought up a number of times this challenge of needing multidisciplinary solutions, but not really having mechanisms to formulate them. Thinking about the rural nutrition challenge, but not really having anybody thinking about how that is incorporated into urbanization policy. Do any of you have examples of how this sort of multidisciplinary solution identification has worked well?
No.
Can you imagine one?
Oh, absolutely. But I think it, again, goes to some of the discussions that came up earlier is the decisions that get made that result in how cities develop happen at very different scales, often at these either micro or regional scales. At least the science that we do is at a different temporal scale, as well as a different spatial scale. So I think resolving those scales is really essential. But they're a different scale than the governance scale where the decisions are made. I think that's where one of the challenges lie. I think the other thing that's a big issue also is when we think about the resources that are used to build and operate the built environment, they don't come from the local environment, right? So there's this other set of spatial externalities where we're mining for materials or for energy that come from very, very far away places. And so even if we're trying to make our urban places sustainable, what are the impacts on these other places?
Yeah, so I'm sorry, I'm going to go back to the argument with Karen a little bit. And I think there's a crux in this, and there's maybe perhaps something ideologically behind that. But I'm sorry, this is not like the two of us are against, but there is something very powerful about living in cities with respect to access of education, access to health. And I think that's something that we can't, I'm sorry, this is just an itch in myself, but I think that's something that we want future generations, especially those in the poorest countries in the world, to benefit from. And that's what we have benefited from, whether it's in Europe or whether it's in the Americas. The question, I think, and I think this is maybe more in the details, is so how best to do that so that it gives us sustainable and healthy, and healthy cities. And I think that goes to the issue. And again, I just don't feel that we have the right formula to tell or to guide policymakers or planners in terms of governance. I mean, there's this kind of magic word of governance and good governance, but I don't think we have the science behind that to do that. And I'm sorry, I'm deviating from your question, but it's just something that's kind of, so I work downstream from many of these issues. We work at the end, taking care of patients or doing prevention in communities, and you can just see it every day that those are kind of the challenges that we haven't gone through, day to day. This kind of the nitty gritty on that, and I think it's fair to say in the United States as well. When we think of cities like I'm from New Jersey, so when I think of Perth Amboy, Elizabeth, and Newark, and I think those are the same issues that go on that we've experienced, whether it's in Brazil or in Mumbai or in Kenya.
So I should clarify,
Please.
Should there be misunderstanding, I am not suggesting that we arrest urbanization or halt it, but rather that if we had constraints, whether they're land constraints, I'm not suggesting building constraints, but just land constraints, we would build cities differently. So it's very clear. So I mean, it's indisputable that cities are more productive and offer lots of social benefits. But the question is, like you said, the devil is in the details. Is how do we configure them? How are they constructed? How do people use the urban space? And it's very clear that sprawling, low-density development is not productive, has a massive toll on human well-being as well as the environment. And so we know that those are the styles of development that we want to avoid. I mean, then why not think about strategies that allow us, that use that as a starting point? One thing that I'm not a planner, I've never even taken a planning class. As a scientist, I think, okay, we develop models, we know we can forecast what the future may look like or develop scenarios. Why not use that as the starting point? If we say we're going to add 2.5 billion people into cities, and we also want to preserve clean air, clean water, biodiversity, we We want to have food provisioning services, all of these things. Those end up being constraints. How do we work backwards and develop, whether it's numerical models or policy models, to get us to that place? So that's where I'm coming from. And I think, constraining land, it could be one big factor.
So since the panel title has global in it and global cities, et cetera, I want to reset the conversation a little bit, because when I'm hearing this discussion, and even I was using some examples like New Haven and Houston and what these places look like, but I just want to give you a sense of what the rest of the world, in case you haven't had a chance to visit cities or live in cities in the rest of the world, what the scale of the problem is. And these things that we're talking about, like that type of tinkering, is not the margin that matters. So I come from Dhaka, Bangladesh. That's where I grew up. It's the worst place on earth. No, I mean, that's not just a subjective, it's rated as the worst place to live on earth. Like some years, when there was hyperinflation in Zimbabwe, Harare might have been a bit worse, or when Damascus was being bombed, like one year it was rated worse, but the Economist Intelligence Unit rates it every year, and Dhaka is always in the top three, bottom three. And just to give you a sense of what type of challenges we have. So the neighborhood I grew up in, it's a neighborhood that my parents now live in. It was a nicer neighborhood, so we couldn't afford to live there. It had mostly 2-story houses, so either single family or 2 flats, 2 apartments. And so there were 2 families living on each lot, right? Every single one of them has been torn down and replaced with buildings that now house maybe 40 families. So the population has increased, from when I was a kid to now, in the same neighborhood, has increased something like 20, 30-fold, okay? And when I was growing up, nobody had cars. We didn't have a car, right? But now everybody does, and people have multiple cars. So that means the car ownership here the population's gone up, say 20, 30-fold, and the car ownership rate is higher, and so the number of cars have gone up 50-fold, okay? The roads are exactly as wide as they were when I was growing up, in fact, because of encroachment, because of parking, and because of street side sellers, etc. The road is narrower than what it was, okay? So the city was designed, we're talking about the 80s, right? So the city was designed to handle a certain number of cars in population. There's 50 times as many cars as it was designed for, right? And of course, if you have that many families, and congestion is really, really bad. If you look at Google Maps, you know how they have green, orange, red. Dhaka is always black, it just doesn't move, right? And so that means that you need, the people who live there, they need schools, clinics, right in the neighborhood, right? So now it used to be a residential neighborhood, now you have lots of commercial services, et cetera. And there's the fact that there's no more road. Even for a while, there wasn't even that much more electricity generation capacity. So we had blackouts. So firms in Bangladesh report experiencing a blackout more than once per working day for the entire year on average. Right? And that's just a really basic level of sort of failure in planning, right? Where we need to, I just wanted to make sure that the audience understands that there are these very, very basic problems that need to be solved in most of the world, right? Whereas, when we are talking about cities making New Haven a little bit more like Melbourne or something, right? So we're going from here to here, and the rest of the world is over there, and those are the challenges that we really need to grapple with.
So you're making me think a little bit about, in preparing for the panel, I was reading a 2011 report from the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy that found that retrofitting older cities, kind of to Karen's point as well about trying to restrict how much land we're using for cities, that retrofitting older cities can be up to 3 times more expensive. And this is 2011, so I imagine these numbers are changing as well. And so this idea of starting brand new, can you imagine a future where we are breaking new ground, and can you see from your different perspectives some real benefits to that? Albert, I'm thinking about how you might help with some of these inequity challenges, or think about infrastructure in a different way that would enable better access.
Yeah. Okay. So the just before getting to that, I think Mushfiq, I think you kind of created the straw man in your argument about these policy failures, and I do think that just to remind you, I think the average life expectancy for a black male from 125th Street in Manhattan is lower than I believe the average mean life expectancy of a person in Dhaka, right? So,
a lot richer. The person in Dhaka, I mean, okay.
Right.
For sure.
There is, there have been successes that have happened, kind of important, especially, with those, you can say those policy failures in terms of access to education. So calling Dhaka the worst place in the world, it needs some, qualification on that. In terms, with respect to the policy failures that I think, some of the ones which I think Karen was probably alluding to, what we do know what went wrong. But going back to the question about retrofitting cities, so Karen's point is an extremely valid one. There's going to be there's continued urbanization. It's going to happen in Asia. It's going to happen in Africa. Cities need to be planned, and there is probably a good track record of what didn't work. I'm not sure if we have a really good track record of what worked, but at least so Karen's point is, I'm thinking about those cities that have already been urbanized, and we can just think about Dhaka in one sense, but also Mumbai and Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, and these places. Those communities, those disorganized, peri-urban, sometimes urban slum, what we call them slum settlements or shanty towns, they're not going to go away. And so the question, and this gets back to the issue of whether we call it retrofitting or slum upgrading, and that's my concern about that we don't have all the answers. And this goes back to, I think, the point that was made earlier in the discussion, a lot of the discussion between street grids, and I think I really like Dr. Rubin's, comment. He said, don't look for urban form to fix the equity issue. And I think really inherent in many of what we know from the past, and this is not necessarily, means that locks us into what we do in the future, but when we think about the past, I don't think we were really at there. What were we going to do with all the slums? I know Brazil best, so it's 30% of the population lives in what's considered slum settlements. And what are we going to do? And Brazil has already urbanized. 90% of the population is urban. What are we going to do for them? And I'm not sure we have those answers. We know a little bit of what works in terms of provision of access to services. But if you're in a disorganized slum settlement, how are you going to build sewage networks, right? Or in parallel, the traditional parallel network, service networks, or do you put them, how are you going to build these networks in a place like Kibera or Mumbai? How are you going to get access? So I work on Zika virus and arboviruses, and just as an aside, there's a very prescient movie, The Graduate, for those old enough to remember that. The importance of plastics. Well, plastics led to the worldwide urban epidemic of arboviruses such as dengue, Zika, and so forth. How are we going to get good trash collection in disorganized, slum settlements where people already live in? So that I'm thinking more of that perspective. That doesn't discount what needs to be done for future planning and to avoid mistakes. So I'm a little bit pessimistic on that point.
Yeah, I would say that obviously, from my earlier comments, I think building brand new is not necessarily the solution. I mean, we certainly have a lot of science, new material science, engineering on how to build buildings to be more efficient, using low carbon materials and sourcing. So there's a lot of new science around that. But there's also a danger of just throwing out the old because it's old. And I worry sometimes that using just a purely financial cost-benefit analysis is not the way to decide whether we should preserve buildings or not. given that there is a lot of science around retrofitting and improving building envelopes to make them more efficient. I mean, Elihu here is the expert on preservation of space and placemaking. And we know that there are a lot of new cities that are going up in many parts of the world, especially in Asia, that are soulless. They're brand new, shiny, all of that, but they don't have a soul. The other issue is that, to the point that Mushfiq just made, that a lot of the places that are urbanizing are not going to use the most novel science on buildings. So we're now in I think this is a LEED certified something platinum building. Okay, I mean, it's state of the art. My office, by the way, is up the hill in a probably LEED certified gray building. I mean, my building is like a sieve. But it has so much character.
The worst is the School of Public Health.
Oh, no.
That's the worst. That is the worst.
But we have to remember that a lot of these places that are urbanizing are not going to use the newest science to build the most efficient buildings.
Mushfiq, what's your perspective on using innovation to solve some of these problems? If science can't be the lead, are there other strategies?
Good. I was just reflecting on everything that's being said in the panel, and when we're talking about problems in rich countries as well as in poor countries, I think there's just massive failure of political will to solve these problems. I think that's the big story here, right? Like if you want to address what's happening in slums, right? It does require the Brazil. No government in Brazil has control of Hixon, right? It's hard for you to do anything if you don't have the infrastructure in place or the mechanisms in place to even start working there, right? And then instead, when you were talking about retrofitting, again, my reaction is the level of the problem in developing country cities is just so different. So we just with an architectural firm, I just did some surveys of slums in Ahmedabad in Gujarat, India, right? And the way it's not about retrofitting. What's happening is that any little space, so people don't have carefully documented property rights. So any little space that they get, the way that they create property rights for themselves is to build a wall. Like any extra money you have left in a particular year, you build a little bit of an extension and you build up that way. And so we had the experts in this case, civil engineers and architects, rate these places in terms of their safety, in terms of their building quality, et cetera, right? And this is in an earthquake zone as well. And this is a disaster waiting to happen. If there's any movement of the earth, there's going to be a huge disaster. So, and again, why is that happening? So just like the failure of political will that's preventing San Francisco from expanding or extending its doors to more people who want to live there, right? And it's the same type of failure, but just manifested very differently in developing country cities where, there's in-migrants. So I agree with Albert on the Bangladesh point. It is a terrible place to live, but the reason why people live there, why it has become terrible, is because the country's experienced incredible growth, right? It's averaged 7% growth rate for the last 10, 15 years. So it's a country that went from famously a basket case, according to Henry Kissinger, to now a lower middle income country, right? So the country's been doing great, but then along with it, as the country's growing, right, there's migrants coming into the city. So okay, the country's growing, and then Dhaka accounts for 25% of the GDP. So of course people are going to flood in there, right? But you need to have plans for the people who are flooding in, and for us to plan well or execute any of the innovations that we might be discussing in this room, right? You actually first have to take political control, and that's just not there. The basic building block isn't there.
Sarah, can I make a quick comment on that? So I think I took a pessimistic view, but after hearing Mushfiq, I'm going to go the opposite, just to be disagreeable, and be more optimistic. So I don't know if many of you ever saw this movie Cidade de Deus, or The City of God, which really tells the history of one slum settlement in the peri-urban area of Rio de Janeiro. And it was a squatter settlement with very little services that developed into a very condensed, and all the bad things, narrow roads, what do you call it, crime. But there have been positive stories, or positive parts of that story. And I think one solution, and I'm going to just go back to the example of Brazil, is really the poverty amelioration social programs, conditional cash payment programs that were done in the 2000s in Brazil, implemented in Brazil, where you had poverty reduction, and you had in these marginalized slum communities, you had pharmacies setting up, you had dental clinics, you had department stores, shopping malls in the middle of slums that were completely marginalized before those implementation of social programs. So I think there are some answers, and I'd be optimistic. And these are now become very vibrant communities. Whereas, when in the community that we've been working in the last 25 years, it was almost unheard of anyone to get a college degree. Now, 20-30% of the high school graduates are going on to college. So we see improvements in health, and a lot of that. The streets are still narrow, right? There's still, there are commercial, they're even become narrower, just as in Dhaka. But the quality of life and improvement has been...
So Albert, you're setting the standards too low. Of course, Rio de Janeiro is better than it was 20 years ago, right? But the whole world is a lot better than it was. So think about what happened to, where Korea was relative to Brazil in 1950 and where Korea is relative to Brazil today.
Right, but the solution for Korea is not the solution that's going to be implemented, much less in Brazil.
I'm just saying but the standards for what we should be thinking about as success for Bangladesh or for Brazil shouldn't be what Bangladesh was like in 1970, right?
Yeah, it's a good point.
Karen, where do you fall on this spectrum? Are you with the pessimist or the optimist in this?
At the end of the day, I'm actually an optimist. I'm definitely an optimist. And I think, to your point about the innovation, clearly innovation is key. And I think one thing that I would hate it for us to limit ourselves into believing is that innovation is only possible with lots of either technology or lots of money. And years ago, I was on a panel with Jaime Lerner, who I imagine a number of you know, who was the former mayor of Curitiba. And he said, I'll show you, you want innovation? So he transformed the city of Curitiba in a very short period. And in this panel, this UN panel, we're talking about sustainable cities, and he said, if you want innovation, you need two things. Give me a budget line and cut off the 3 zeros. If you have, and he said the other thing is you need to implement this very quickly. You need to have the conviction to implement your ideas very, very quickly to be innovative. And so I'll just go back to the issue of budgets, right? Whether it's a land budget or some kind of time constraint. I think the problem right now is we're waiting for the best science to come in to say, okay, we know how to build the perfect city that's equitable and low carbon and all of that. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for this, the cities are already being built in all the ways that we don't want them to be. And there is going to be a closing window of opportunity, because once these cities of tomorrow are built, we're going to be locked into certain patterns of land use, of energy consumption, transport, and it's try to wrestle a car out of someone's hand after they've been driving, Tim. It's difficult.
And one quick point about innovation is, of course it's required, and I also want to underline that what I'm about to say is not to the exclusion of the macro scale solution that we need, which is, as I said, political will, right? But on the margin, what can we do better? I just want to make sure that everybody understands that innovation doesn't always mean high tech and new products and new technology. So just some
bus lanes, you said.
Yeah, exactly. Bus lane, bike lanes, bike sharing. Or it could be even more low tech than that. So so I've been working with a company called Sanergy in slums in Nairobi, right? And there, this problem we're trying to solve is the fact that people are using flying toilets. Do you guys know what that is? You've already eaten your lunch. I can tell you about what that is. So it's just plastic bags that people then throw out, right? And so Sanergy was founded by 3 young people who got 2 of them are Yale graduates. And then after their MBA, instead of taking the normal like investment banking or consulting path, they went and set up a company in a slum in Nairobi to create like a toilet franchise system where they have kind of like a business in a box, like pay-per-use toilet, and they're trying to get residents in slums to offer the toilet service, and then they have a logistics system set up to collect the waste and then recycle it. Right? And so there, you were talking about sewage system. The thing is that when a slum's already developed, the innovation that might be required is not how do we create a network sewage system here, but how do we identify small enough vehicles that can navigate the roads inside slums, right? And have boxes which can easily be, transported back and forth. Right? So we should just be thinking about, that's just one example. We should just be thinking about innovations in a lot of different ways. And many of the students who are here, and professional school students at Yale, from FES, from SOM, right? This is an example of 3 people who got degrees like you did and did a very impressive job of starting to solve a problem basically immediately after graduation.
Thank you all so much. I think with that, we can open it up for questions, and I just want to give you a sense of the strategy. I think you used this morning as well. We'll try to gather 3 and then allow the panel to ruminate on those for a little while.
So my questions are one is, does everybody need to really move to the city in order to be productive? Quickly, a context, I'm from the Philippines. I live here for 14 years, and for the last 5 years, I've been going back to the Philippines and lived in the mountains where my mom is from. And I've realized that these 2 villages that I live actually are all relatives. On one side is my maternal side of my mom, and the other side, the paternal side. And I realized that all those who moved out of that village in the mountains, like really far, have become more educated, more financially stable. But those who have stayed have actually become poor, but land rich, but cash strapped. The problem is that those villages provided coal that powered the city of Cebu. I'm from Cebu City, which is in south central part of the Philippines. It's a very small island, has a population density of 29,000 per square kilometers or 79,000 per square miles. And so I was thinking maybe they should move to the city, but then the city is congested and there's no more place for them to live. And I don't think they're willing to move to the city. So the second question is, can there be infrastructures that make the city productive that can be built in the rural areas because they actually provide for food? It's called the vegetable basket of if not in Central Visayas, at least for Cebu province. So we can't take out all of my people and bring them to the city. It's going to provide for food. So that's sort of like become my personal kind of thing with my other relatives who are so well off, and we go there and we see that they're really, needing help. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. One thing just a quick note is that Ireland is English speaking today because the rural Irish-speaking population came to America out of starvation while the ones living in the cities were able to access the food aid and all that. So we've actually seen the advantage of urban environments in that case. But the quick thing is, in terms of land use and maybe not creating restrictions, but creating incentives, because I think New Haven probably has the same problem I've been seeing in Poughkeepsie lately also, which is you have clear cutting when you also still have abandoned brownfields, and it just makes absolutely no sense that people are not building upon an area when there's that opportunity. And is Henry George's economics program a crank fringe idea still, or is that something that people are reconsidering to incentivize development on that kind of dense level? And then also, New York City, had the foresight in the 19th century to buy huge tracts of land to create a reservoir system. Is there a possibility of creating a food shed, essentially, instead of just a watershed, where you have this, a bond, essentially, issued to buy land to preserve from creating these, tracts of, second homes and all that, And that's also an opportunity for black farming to reemerge, because we've lost that in the African American culture of farming. It seems there's a desire to revive it, but not the land availability. So are those approaches rather than just constricting land?
Great. Great.
Hi, I'm a second year student. My name is Sandeep. I'm a second year master's student here. So I just wanted to kind of add a little bit context to Dr. Koh's comment about the pessimism. But cities, mostly these poor cities in poor countries, have what they have is the wealth of social cohesion, and that's something that's overlooked. Versus in larger cities, you might sort of miss some of those things. But coming to my question, I just wanted to talk about the other dimension that hasn't been discussed all day today. That's on overconsumption. And I just want to hear your views, individual, based on your, backgrounds, what you think about the problem of overconsumption is. Because we talk about production and how to, conserve things based on, actually using less, but also that's what's linked to is actual overconsumption of fossil fuels or even products. And one of the examples that we were talking about earlier, Peter and I, he's a PhD student and he just left, was the whole social political structure of this country or the entire world is based on consumption, because GDP and economic development is very much linked to consumption. And how do you tackle that problem of decoupling these issues? Because for example, Apple is the most important example where you actually have this product which Apple makes, and unless you actually buy that product, there are these interconnections through the economic system that's actually overlooked. So if people stop buying Apple, there's this chain of events that happens, or any product that happens when things kind of go sort of negatively impact. So I just want to hear, especially from the economic side, what you think about the problem of overconsumption is and how you tackle those issues.
Great, thank you all so much. Excellent job in developing questions that can span the whole panel, so I applaud you on that. I wonder if we can start with really the first question, which was, does everyone have to move to the city to be productive?
That seems like that was for me. No, Salamat. And I'm going to answer in two ways. Okay, so one facetious answer I'm going to give you, which doesn't really answer your question, but that is useful, is that people are moving to the city whether you like it or not, or whether you and I like it or not, right? And poverty is urbanizing. We need to, all the challenges that we're thinking about, right? They're just going to get bigger and bigger, right? And people are moving to the city because, as you already notice in your communities, it's been the sensible place for people to move. Okay. But now let's think about, okay, is this actually a good thing for society, right? And here's what I'd like you to reflect on. So North America, US, Canada, they were pretty rural places about 200 years ago, right? These countries urbanized. Look where they are now. It's not a bad place to be, right? If Philippines can follow the development trajectory, or my country, Bangladesh, follows the development trajectory that US, Canada followed, I'd be very happy, okay? So what happened? And then, of course, 200 years ago, a lot of food was being produced in rural areas. Lots of people were working on it here, right? And then I'm sure they had, somebody in a room like this was raising a similar question. Oh, everybody's moving for these manufacturing jobs in the city. What's going to happen to our food? What happened? Technology, innovation, right? You now have, and it's not just in North America. I visited a farm in Mato Grosso do Sul in Brazil, which has become like the world's farm. Like, the one farm was the size of Singapore. Okay? And it was run on 80 full-time employees. That's it. Okay? So there's been incredible mechanization. A lot of that innovation started in the United States, right, but has now spread. And we produce a lot more food a lot more efficiently, right, because of that mechanization, because we're taking up less land to produce the same thing. Okay, and then what type of an effect did it have on my country? So when I was growing up in Bangladesh, a lot of the policy discussions, like in TV talk shows, was about food security, right? We have 100 million people at that time, and the land mass is the size of, say, Wisconsin. okay? And the population is projected to increase to 150 million. How on earth, we're already struggling to feed so many people, how on earth can we feed, so think about half the US population in Wisconsin, right? And that was an important concern. Today, it's no longer a concern, right? And, turning to the optimists, it's no longer a concern. I mean, we've made incredible strides. That's not what we worry about. And the answer was this type of technological innovations. Okay? So when people move out and we need to still produce food, that creates the economic conditions for us to innovate and continue to produce food that will feed the people who need to be fed. Okay?
I just want to add something really quickly. I mean, on your point about urbanization and economic development, I mean, historically, if you look at the historical data, it's very clear that the degree to which a country's population is urbanized is strongly correlated with its economic development levels. Yeah. But there has been a delinking of that in the last 10 years, especially for places in South America and also in places in Africa. So we're now seeing urbanization without the parallel economic development, and that becomes a really big problem where we see the urbanization of poverty. So I would answer that question a little bit differently. I think we have a big question about what is the role of cities and in the production and consumption process. I think that that's a big question about possibly technology, possibly about what is the role of the hinterland in the production process, because that's also changing as well. So.
So my answer is that this is part of the process of development. It's going to happen, right? And we need to face up to the challenges that come up when people are moving to the cities. And I don't think it's a bad thing. And there was a question. I mean, I took up a lot of time. There's a question about Ireland. If anybody want to take that. No.
We did have a question about. I took it as land use. I'm thinking about clear cutting versus abandoned brownfields, use of abandoned brownfields. I don't know, Albert, from a public health perspective, if you have thoughts on the relative decision making in that case.
I would cede to my colleague on the left, who probably on that point.
Well, you all probably already know how I feel. I mean, I'm the one that gets my shoes remended many times. So, I mean, we should just reuse the stuff that we already have. Don't throw out the old just because it's old. Just reuse it, repurpose it. Yeah.
Okay, so so that segues into the question about overconsumption. So, I was struggling to think when you were, so there is a general overconsumption problem. I'm sure we'd all be happier if we could get away with consuming less, or maybe not me, but everybody else could get away with consuming less. That made me happier. But I was then trying to link it to where I was struggling was link it to, the city discussion that we're having, right? So is overconsumption more of a city-specific problem, right? I actually don't think so. In fact, if anything, it's the opposite, which is that if we, so think about it this way. The problem with the areas outside of Dallas and outside of Houston is that's the overconsumption problem, where we're taking up a lot of land, right? We're building bigger houses because we can't afford to out there, right? That means that you become a car-dependent society. Roads have to be built, right? And so people who live outside of cities end up consuming a lot more resources than people who are living much more densely packed, right?
Can I just add? Don't you think that as an economist, you'd know this probably better, but isn't consumption associated with class? And the fact that there's a concentration of rich in the urban centers that consume much more compared to those in the. I understand you're making this argument about economy of scale, but I don't think that's how history has played out.
That's the condition of being rich, not the condition of being urban or rural. Yeah. People who are rich in rural areas also consume a lot.
Sure, but how many percent of the world's rich live in rural areas?
Yeah, but that's
according
that's a condition
to
of being.
My colleague,
but that's not
a
causal effect of. But that's not a causal effect of being in the city. That's a causal effect of being rich, right? So if I take the rich person, all I'm saying is that if I take the rich person and move them out of the city, I'm not going to solve that problem.
So I have a colleague at FES, Justin Farrell, who just came out with a book called Billionaire Wilderness. And he studies the billionaires in, it's a Wyoming? Wyoming, yeah, that's right. Right. So yes, there are a lot of very rich people who live in very rural places, and they consume even more than one would expect. Yeah.
Okay, but the causal relationship is being rich, and it's not being rural.
It's not being urban. We have
It's
to
not being
decouple
urban,
whether you're
Right. So okay, let's decouple it. So you're saying that, but I thought Mushfiq was making the argument that being rural.
Makes you actually, yeah, so I'm going
Less
further than just
So what's the
that.
primary driver? Is it being rich? Which I was saying, my point was that it's class, right? Or is it being rural, or is it versus urban?
So we are all going to agree that when you're richer, you consume more.
Okay.
We all agree on that because our marginal propensity to consume is positive. You have an extra dollar, you're going to consume part of it, right? And now the question is, like, let's take two people, let's hold that constant. Let's take two people who are equally rich in a rural area versus an urban area. So I'm going further and saying that the people who are living in the urban area at the same level of wealth, right? People who are living in the rural area, they are using up resources more inefficiently.
So let's pull this back to the issue of where I think the major challenge is, which is in lower middle income countries or developing countries.
Yeah.
What's the attributable fraction of that, of consumption? And I'm sorry, let's take this out of the developed world context, but let's go back to where all of this is really going to happen in the, where the 1 billion people who are going to, in the next 10 or 15 years, what's that attributable fraction of that argument that you just made?
So if there are going to be more people in urban areas, if there are going to be more rich people in urban areas, then you're going to get more and more consumption in urban areas.
Right, but what is the consumption of somebody who's, a rural subsistence farmer and doesn't have access to services and living in the rural area, versus the person in the cities? Just not to blame the person in the rural,
Right.
the attributable fraction is I think it's going to be very small, right?
Right. So think about whether all of that consumption is a bad thing. So let's say you move to the city, right? Now you're sending your kids to school. In the rural areas you weren't. Is that consumption bad? No. Let's say you're now eating more. In the rural area you weren't getting 3 meals a day. Is that consumption bad? No. Right? It's not, just because we're seeing consumption doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. Now, the case of overconsumption, which I interpreted that to be some sort of inefficient, unneeded consumption, that is a condition of being rich. Right?
Right, and not being a condition of rural versus urban.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I meant to rephrase it in the sense that I was trying to get to the point of how do you reduce consumption without affecting the growth, economic growth? Because as your economic status improves, your consumption grows.
Right.
But I think the issue is, how we talk about sustainability in terms of trying to, conserve things, but overconsumption from the economic point of view is what I was trying to get to.
Right.
How do you get to that? What is the magic, answer to that?
So I'm not sure there's a magic answer, but I love some of the visuals from this morning's plenary talk. Like when we were talking about, we need jobs. We need to get from one place to another. We need to get from home to job, right? There are ways that you can do it in a high consumption way, having a car and 8 square meters to yourself, right? Or you could do it in a low consumption way by sharing public transit with people or riding a bike, et cetera, right? So then, we had great ideas this morning about things like, okay, how do you make it in people's interest to solve that problem, the mobility problem, right? But do it in a way that's not as, that doesn't impose as many costs to society, right? So one way you do it is that you make it very, very convenient to use bicycles, you make it very convenient to use public transit, and you make it very, very inconvenient to do the high consumption way, right? So you have a certain amount of transport lane space, right? If I start allocating more of them to bikes and I take it away from parking and I take it away from car lanes, right? I will have changed people's decisions such that they will decide not to consume in ways that are inefficient.
Can I ask how that lines up with what you were telling us before about how your home city just shows up as black on Google Maps, so everybody's bought a car,
Yeah.
but it's not incenting changes in behavior. How does that line up?
Yeah, because I mean, those are the big policy failures that we have. So we were talking about policy failures about like what the width of the road should be. But here's another, let's talk about another failure that we all got excited about. Do you guys know about the Tata Nano? It became a big, it actually became a big scandal because of the West Bengal government, et cetera. So India, the company Tata, a big conglomerate, was trying to produce the people's car, right? Like a car that would cost $2,000 that all middle-class Indians could now afford, right? Sounds great. Oh, we're now providing a service to the middle class, or we're providing a good that was aspirational for the middle class. Is that really a good idea? Right? So, I mean, governments are making all these choices about what to tax, what not to tax, right? What to incentivize. Where do I, if I were to provide 300 acres of land to a company to build a car that will flood the streets of India now, right? I mean, those are choices we're making that will have effects on the environment, that will have effects on our consumption patterns, and they're terrible. Right? We're making policy choices that creates incentives and that affects people's consumption patterns.
Constraints.
Any other points on these questions, or shall we go for some more?
Hi, thank you very much. So to your point that I've heard multiple times today that it's a lack of political will, coming as a Master's of Public Policy student out of a political background, I've often found, domestically at least, that it maybe is less political will so much as operationalizing that will. To Dr. Rosen's point about research we can use, or that there's a key stakeholder throwing up roadblocks because they're afraid the change is going to hurt them. To Dr. Seto's point about how do you get them out of their car when they think that's the only way they can get there. So I'm wondering, in your experience globally, if you could dig down a little bit more, is it that there's not the will at all to do anything? There's no interest in change. There's no interest in even, making these changes, or is it, fear of a key stakeholder that's holding it up, or fear of preventing the progress and growth that they see from development, that they think it'll all fall apart if they make any changes? Thank you.
When I saw the title of this panel, my initial thoughts were sort of the combination of increased density and population increases globally, as well as the rising reality of climate migration. So that sort of crisis or question from a policy as well as a real estate development and all sorts of sustainability science, all backgrounds have to address these problems. And I'm wondering if you three could talk a little bit about, positive or negatively, what your thoughts are on climate migration and density and how you're seeing cities developing. That's just sort of kindly discuss.
And I have the microphone over here. I'm Emma Johnson. I'm a second-year master's student at the Forestry School. I'm wondering, a few of you have talked about that there isn't a lot of urbanization that's happening in the United States, but I'm wondering, with climate change, if that could be shifting as sea levels rise and cities along the coast become inhabitable and people have to move out, if there is going to be a trend where new cities are built inland to accommodate those people who have to move out of those cities along the coast, or if it's just going to be a greater push for those cities inland. And so speaking about how climate change could be driving a new wave of urbanization in the United States.
Thank you all. That's quite a lot to work on. Do you want to start around political will?
Or actually, I was going to take Emma's question first.
Sure,
because
go right ahead.
It's linked to the other question about climate migration. 19-ish years ago, I was studying urban development in southern China in a city called Shenzhen. And we already had climate projections of sea level rise. This is year 1999, 2000. And I remember meeting with the mayor and planners. And we had been using satellite data to track how the city had been developing. And the city had been growing out into the sea. And so in this meeting, I brought some climate projections, and I said, this is what's going to happen in I think it might have been like 2025, like way far away. And their answer was, oh, we're consulting with the Dutch. We're going to build dikes. And I remember leaving that meeting feeling like, oh, this is a disaster. So fast forward, we're now in 2019. China has doubled and tripled down in building all along the coast. But it's not just China, it's also here in the US. I'm sure everybody in this room has an opinion about whether New Orleans should have or should not have been built, what should happen to Houston, even here in coastal Connecticut. I think the challenge, though, is it's not happening overnight. And so because this is happening very slowly, there isn't this sense of urgency. There isn't the time constraint. There isn't the budget for people to act. And people would have to act quickly. I think that we are learning a lot from fires in California, because there are lots of places now where the insurance company is saying, we're not insuring here. But the question is that going to be enough of a disincentive for people to move out of those places where they either might have cultural ties, family ties, whatever it may be, jobs. And I think that it comes down to issues of incentives and disincentives of, as well as political will about people moving and relocating.
Are there dikes now in Shenzhen?
There are, but in many cities across China, there are dikes, yeah.
Made by the Dutch? Or
Consulting
after consulting the Dutch?
Made by the Chinese in 10 days, but consulted by the Dutch, yeah.
Well, maybe I'll go to the political will issue. And well, before that, I think just to make a point that many of the cities, when we're thinking about maybe Jakarta, Manila, Mumbai, Dhaka, the worst, the most vulnerable of these populations are the ones who are living in the worst land quality. And so in this argument, and just going back to the morning session, the most vulnerable are going to be probably the most marginalized, living in slum settlements in these areas. And we don't really have good solutions for those. I think this has been discussed in Mumbai for the last 40 or 50 years, and I think probably it's the same, it's kind of like the emperor's clothes type of issue that this was predicted 40 or 50 years ago in Mumbai. This issue about political will and operational will, I mean, obviously the answer is a little bit of both. But I think it does go to specific issues, structural issues, and some of these are legal issues. For example, land tenure, social rights. The second is so having when we think about political will, it means different things to different people, but there are some structural components to it. It's this issue of good governance that goes, and it also goes into the market failures and the externalities, and the reasons why the financing part. So I think unfortunately the answer to that question is a very complex question, and it's a question that I think goes back and Karen's point is good. We don't want the best being the enemy of the good. But I think what we don't have is really good metrics of what worked and what didn't work in terms of at least somebody from the health side, thinking about urban planning, knowing that we can't do what we did 100 years ago. The paradigms of 100 years ago are not feasible or implementable for much of the developing world.
So I do have some direct answers to questions. So I love your term operationalizing the will. I like it better than how I phrased it on political will. So what I want to highlight is that we talked about different problems in different types of cities in Bangladesh versus the United States, right? So in Bangladesh, the good news is that we're talking about such basic problems, right? That there are very many low-hanging fruit, right? So you just need someone to take charge, or a leader with power, like the prime minister, to just say to somebody, you know what, I want you to work on this problem, and you're empowered to do this, right? Don't even show me what you're doing, just go and get it done, right? And we'll have the political apparatus behind you, right? And if something like that happens, sometimes things change, right? And you see that happening, like where people just take on tasks and they do it, right? Now, I worked on projects with the Odisha government in eastern India, where for some reason the city commissioner of Bhubaneswar thought I was, like somebody told him I was some great economist, and so he was like, I'm willing to do anything you want. And so we were very ambitious. We started building shared latrines all over slums in Bhubaneswar. And then it turns out the project got stuck for years because I didn't realize that the city commissioner actually didn't have that much power. Like, I mean, he had power, but then so did 5 other people and agencies. Like, we couldn't even get the land permission in order to build a latrine from those communities, right? And so sometimes, democracy sucks, and it's just like there's too many people who who can get in the way and who have opinions, right? And sometimes it's just hard to just get things done. And then in the U.S., again, I think we have the problem of we're being recorded, right? Oh, so maybe I should be. Okay, let me try to rephrase. Yeah, about I'm not like a dictator in the making or anything like that. So, no, but we have a problem where, if you want to solve the train problem from New Haven to New York, it turns out it's extremely difficult because there are lots of permissions that are required, and people aren't going to be willing to give up some of their rights, right? Whereas in China, when we were talking about the Philippines and people moving, or people need to move. So I've been working on projects with the government in China as well. And here, they have a plan for moving 10 million people in this decade, okay? And I've now visited in various places, they just built up a little town, and then they go to these villages and say, you no longer live here, this is the town you live in, okay? And that's how migration happens, right? Okay, so finally I'm not advocating for that, by the way, that's just how things happen. Now, finally, on the climate migration, I just want to highlight some work by really excellent former Yale students, Claire Balboni, who's now a professor at MIT. We're very proud of her. So she worked on infrastructure development in Vietnam, right? And looked at exactly where road infrastructure was being invested. And there's a huge coastal bias, right? And so now when you take into account climate projections on what would happen to those coastal areas, and that you'd lose the value of a lot of that investment just based on sea level rises, right? It's just like the set of infrastructure investment decisions they're making even today is just it doesn't make any sense, right? And in fact, there's so much coastal bias that even if you don't account for the projected sea level rises, et cetera, even then there's too much investment happening on the coast and not enough inland, right? So these are cases where we are just, so sometimes the climate migration problem is, look, when we know that for economic reasons people are coming and we can do it in a planned way, even then we're failing, right? And then when there's migration due to push factors, which are difficult to predict because suddenly there's greater incidence of drought somewhere, that's going to be a huge problem. And then even when we are planning, a lot of governments seem to be making the wrong choices, right? I've been complaining about government a lot today, but it's not that economists have better answers either.
And maybe a quick aside, I think it brings back to, I think a point Karen made, a good point, is that, kind of this push-pull. You've seen in certain places in Latin America, and particularly the Caribbean, there's this decoupling between urbanization and economic growth. And when you think a place like Haiti, a country like Haiti, where it's undergone dramatic urbanization, yet there's been no increase in public health, in economic growth. So I think a lot of this is contextual, right? And I think that's probably the important point in some of these answers is what is the push and what's the pull, and how that takes that affects that balance between political will and operationalizing that will.
I was endeavoring to try to summarize some key points here, but we've been to quite a few different places, so I think I won't do that. Instead, just thank the panel for all of their thoughts.
Thank you.
My name is Asha Ghosh, and I'm working with FES to launch the new urban specialization, as well as to build more multidisciplinary research on critical urban issues across Yale. And I have the pleasure of introducing our closing keynote speaker, Professor Diane Davis. She is the Charles Dyer Norton Professor of Regional Planning and Urbanism and the Chair of the Department of Urban Planning and Design at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. Before moving to the GSD in 2011, she was the head of the International Development Group in the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT, where I had the fortune of being a graduate student at that time. She's trained as a sociologist. Her research interests include the relations between urbanization and national development, comparative urban governance, socio-spatial practice in conflict cities, urban violence, and new territorial manifestations of sovereignty. She has published a number of books, including her most recent one, Transforming Urban Transport, which came out in 2018, and her book, Discipline and Development, Middle Classes and Prosperity in East Asia and Latin America, was named by ASA as the 2005 Best Book in Political Sociology. She recently authored a study on urban resilience in situations of chronic violence for USAID, which examines the coping and adapting strategies adopted by citizens and authorities to push back against violence in 7 cities around the world. Some of her recent research initiatives have included looking at the role of political leadership in transforming urban transport and developing more sustainable social housing policies for Mexican cities. And on a personal note, when I was at MIT, I had spent a year working on my research on a particular city, but for various reasons, I was not really happy with the outcomes of the research, and everyone was saying, just write your thesis, just finish it, just graduate and move on. And Diane was the only one who said, if your research is not teaching you something new, don't waste your time. And I think that speaks to the fascinating body of work that she has developed.
Thank you, Esther. Yeah, oh, I guess I'm going to have to, now I'm going to have this thing, my glasses. So I am going to talk about sustainability, so don't worry, that long bio, because I have floated around in a lot of different areas. So I'm really happy to be here. I want to thank Colleen and Karen for inviting me. It's been an extremely rich day. I am so amazed at the kind of collegial tensions that I'm seeing among Yale faculty. I'm learning so much in the exchange and the panels. I loved Tim's presentation this morning. Of course, I know Tina's work, and learned a lot in your keynote. And what I want to do with my keynote is kind of bring all the threads together, because I think I'm going to be landing on San Francisco a little bit. I'm going to be talking about the research that I've done on, transforming urban transport and sustainable urban futures. But I think I do want to. I just wildly taking notes in the last several panels, but I started realizing that now all of a sudden I think I might have a different mandate, which I might be able to address, which is to rescue the profession of planning from all the dissing that we've been having. So that's number one. And then at the end of this panel, I realized, oh no, I have another agenda, which is to rescue politics and governance in the questions about political will. And actually, what is it, this one? Yeah. My presentation is going to allow us to do that. Dare I say one other thing where again, maybe you guys did such a good job of organizing all the people coming together, but I think that one of the questions, there's a couple questions floating around today that I also think I'm hoping to shed some light on. And that has to do with, Latina raised the question, we have to do something, right? And then Karen says, what are you guys doing? You're not doing anything. What are the planners doing? So then, and I'm thinking, well, I'm going to be talking a little bit about that. What does it take to actually do something? I would say my takeaway from the panel this morning was that one of the reasons it's hard to figure out what to do is because there are ideological differences about what to do. What's the balance of the state and the market? And last, again, in this panel, the question of political will. So is it just a matter of political will? So my work that I'm presenting with you, which is that's kind of a summary of 2 of the cases that are in this book that we've just completed, which has 8 case studies. So it was research that was done, and how I'm going to answer all those questions is share with you what we found about what others have done to solve problems related to sustainability. So I'm not necessarily going to offer my own view as a planner, but we studied places that were successful in innovating in transportation. Is there a way to get this on this screen too, or otherwise I'll just look here? All right, so the project that I'm going to be speaking from, and I'm only going to look at 2 of the case studies. This is another issue that I also think makes my talk flow from the second panel, is that this was a global project. We were looking at innovations in transportation around the world. I'm only going to be talking about 2 of the cases, San Francisco and Stockholm, and why I've selected them will be obvious. But the premise of the research, it was funded by the Volvo Research and Educational Foundations. Okay, perfect. Was that and this again gets back to Karen's point. They said to us they've been funding sustainability research in the field of transportation for a decade, if not longer. There are centers of excellence in sustainability at Columbia, in China, in India, at Berkeley, etc. But they came to the conclusion in their foundation that we know what needs to be done. We know what needs to be done. The question is, how do you get it done? And that is the project that we embarked upon 3 years ago. We started that in 2013, which will kind of explain why we started looking at Uber. And the answers that our starting point, and I think it was proven to be the appropriate starting point, as you'll see, or I hope you'll agree with me, was politics and governance. So they called it political leadership, but we found out very early on that political leadership was, I don't want to say it was too narrow of an idea, but it assumed that there was like one person, probably a man, that's making a decision about what needs to be done. And, ultimately the project, TUTPOL, Transforming Urban Transport, the whole political leadership, is really about governance. I think you also saw in my first slide, and I'm going to tell that story about governance and political strategies and tactics used to get things done, because getting things done is tough, through the lens of 2 case studies. I also want to kind of underscore that we were interested, somebody brought up on this panel the notion of innovation. Well, innovation wasn't all high tech, it was high and low tech. We did look at Uber because it was just coming into the kind of public, domain when we started the project in 2013. And I do remember, I don't want to get off too long because I only have a half an hour, but I'm looking at Tim here because he's so involved in that. And by the way, I hope you'll take a look at the case study and see if we missed some of the stuff in it. But we had a big discussion in our working group, our research group, which I was a principal investigator, about whether we should even study Uber. Because from the very beginning, I disliked it personally. I'm so happy we studied it, because it really allowed us to think about the smart mobility transition through the lens of these other innovations. And the innovations that we were looking at, you saw those other case studies, we were all looking for innovations in cities that allowed them to achieve some of these aims, whether environmental, traffic congestion, minimizing car dominance. But there was a wide range, because what can be done, and I think this was Albert's point, what can be done in one city maybe can't be done in another city. So you don't want to hold a really high bar. What you want to do is, can you move the needle in your city in such a way that you can start achieving those aims? And so I won't talk about all the cases that we looked at, but they ranged from bus rapid transit, which like right now you want to yawn in the field of transportation when you think about bus rapid transit. We looked at that in Mexico City. It took 12 years to get 3 lines of bus rapid transit. We looked at in Uber the ride sharing, but we also looked, which I'll talk about more, congestion charging in Stockholm, and I'm very happy to see that's back on the agenda in New York. And we looked at we looked at pedestrianization in New York City. Some might say very simple, but Janet Siddiqui, what they were able to do with just kind of changing the use of streets set off a whole set of things. So I want us to understand that the kind of ideas, the insights that we drew from this research were based on a broad variety of innovations that are both low tech and high tech. starting from the assumption, which I guess is obvious now, especially after the questions today, that this is not easy to do any of these things, including something that might sound as simple as, can you close off a street and put, deck chairs in there, as Jeanette said down. That took a lot of politics, took a lot of negotiating across administrations. So there are obvious reasons, and that gets to answer your question. So I'm resuscitating planning, but I'm resuscitating the relationship between planning and politics, and I would argue, and I teach at the GSD, that planning is politics. So maybe we need another conversation of what do we mean when we say, what are the planners doing and why aren't they doing what they're doing? There's technocratic planners, and then there's planners that are really thinking about engaging the administrative conditions under which they need to act but are constrained. So these are kind of the reasons why it's so hard. Now, the other thing I want to say, I don't want to do too much about the overview of the book, but we had some generalizations in the book, and then it's filled with like these different case studies. But what we found, despite different political systems, so we were looking at Vienna, Stockholm, Paris, New York. So, governance in the United States is very different in Europe. We looked at Latin America, we looked at Seoul, South Korea. All those places have different kind of structures of centralization, decentralization, different political traditions, but we found in all of the cases that these 5 strategies were reproduced in all of those cases. So if you want to, we are hoping that the book will help people who really want to start making change, give them some political strategies and tactics. So these are the strategies. Somebody's already mentioned, so I guess your question on politics, about stakeholder map. Of these things, I would say number 2 is really important. And that is like, how do you frame an issue so people will sign on to it? And we found in the case of transportation that sometimes you don't talk about an innovation in transportation through the lens of transportation, or even mobility. You talk about it with respect to equity, sustainability, something else, climate change, future, et cetera. So those were just kind of, the other, I think, point I want to pull out on this slide is number 4, recruit and empower technical team. And this gets back to Karen's work and all the amazing science work. So science work alone, science and algorithmic work, et cetera, alone will not kind of produce an outcome. But we found in the most successful cases that people used technical skill sets, whether it's in the case of Seoul, Korea, they created a whole research institute that was tied to the mayor, that was they were interacting back and forth with their scientific findings, what their assessment of the issue was, and what was the political possibility of making any progress on those things. And that was institutionalized in the case of Seoul, South Korea. But for example, in San Francisco, we studied referendum 19 in Los Angeles. It was, let me just say a little something about that for a second in terms of innovation. I felt like we had to have a case from the car capital of the world. What do you do when you're in a place like Los Angeles to deal with sustainability? And what we looked at in that study, or for that case, was like the referendum. In California, you have to have a public referendum to kind of make any major legislative change about financing for infrastructure. And they were able to pass, and then the second time around it failed, and then it's passed again just a couple of years ago, to fund transit-oriented development. So to do some funding, but they also had to put a criteria for funding highways in the same time. So it's not necessarily it's mind-boggling with respect to achieving the sustainability aims that everybody in this room cares about, but it helped them push and move the envelope. And in that particular case, we looked a lot at surveys and phone calls and working with it, data analysis about where people are going, et cetera, in order to be able to frame an argument for the voters that they would support. Oh, the last point up there was anticipating resistance. I guess I hope I don't need to have to tell anybody in here. But basically, whatever you're going to promote, somebody's going to be opposed to it. So you basically have to anticipate the nature of that opposition, and you kind of factor that into your strategy. We also found tactics that were helpful, and again, these are across all of the cases. So, and they include like the data to inform decision making. And by the way, Uber itself used data and smartphones to kind of prop up its case as well. So sometimes the government uses data, and sometimes the innovators of a new technology use data itself. referencing, and what we mean by that is like pointing out other places in the world. Somebody asked that question. Where is success happening? That's very important in pushing something. Finding a place where it was possible to move the envelope and have a success. And the other thing that we found that was actually striking to me was the use of prototyping and trials. Seoul, South Korea, Mayor Lee, who's in jail now, I believe, who became the president, really authoritarian, autocratic, but basically he was very engaged with participatory meetings, et cetera, and he also did trials. And when citizens didn't like him or there was a problem, he went back to the drawing board. And we found in a lot of cases, using trials or prototypes is a way to kind of generate conversation and get citizens behind your idea. So I guess one of my points in today is that we were studying these policy successes, and I've already mentioned that some of them are small, low tech, and maybe not very earth-shattering, and some are bigger, like congestion pricing. Of course, Uber is kind of revolutionized in both good and bad ways how we think about mobility. So we started the project thinking about that, and we had a team of political scientists, kind of urban planners, designers, transport type of people. So in the short term, everybody who was pushing any of these 8 policies was really interested in the kind of short-term transformations with respect to mobility patterns. Can you push the envelope against a very unsustainable city? But near the end of the project, and this is my conclusion in the chapter, and I, in full disclosure, not everybody on my team agrees with my assessment of our research, but in academia, you're allowed to have your own voice about things, and you'll see the difference between the introduction of our book, which is written by a very famous political scientist, Alan Altshuler, who was a Secretary of Transportation in Massachusetts. He was a dean at NYU and Kennedy School, et cetera, Mr. Transportation, politics of transportation. But near the end of the project, I started asking myself whether just looking at these one-off policy successes was enough, and whether I should be thinking, or what would be the next step for me to think about what we learned from these different successes. So we started, let me do the next slide first, and I can come back to it. I started asking the question, well, what's being transformed in the long term? Not just the short term, because the project started under the assumption if you got your policy accepted, that allowed you to arrive at claiming transformation or like some progress towards sustainable futures. But what I was trying to think is, like all of our cases, I came to the conclusion that in some places the impact was much more transformative in the long term than the short term. And it wasn't true for all the cases, and we thought they were all interesting and important and first steps. So what we started asking, when I re-looked at all of the case study work, and I worked on all of them, but I wrote the case on Stockholm and helped on the one on Mexico City, because that's the city that I work in most. And we started thinking about, well, whether there's something at the process of implementation, the process of getting a policy achieved, that is part of laying the groundwork for the longer term transformation of a city. So, and that's where I think an insight of planning. Planning is not just the idea, but the process that you have to engage in, that's a part of the how to get a policy accepted. That some of the key is in that process. So with that as and I also threw in a slide because I told Karen I'd talk about equity, but and we didn't look at it as much in the book as I would like, and now that's going to be the second stage of our research. But when you're asking about the sustainable futures, are you transforming things that you'll have an capacity to transform your future in the longer term, not just get your project accepted at that moment? It's very important to ask questions about equity. In other words, who's asking the questions about the long-term sustainable future? Not just us scholars. So, sustainable futures for whom? This is a kind of a typical planning slide. By whom? Who's involved in imagining a future? Why? What are you trying to achieve by thinking about the long term? For families, people, the planet, etc. And then finally, across what scale? You may do something good for your neighborhood, but is that the scale that and that was of course, in Tina's work on Metropolitan, the scale at which you think you're looking for success is very important. So, I will go through these quickly because we have an expert here, and Tim can come up here maybe later. But we were looking at. We wanted to go through the kind of, everybody really knows what ride sourcing is, and Uber kind of experimented in San Francisco. One of the things that struck me when we started doing the work is how they basically were operating illegally for quite a long time. And as somebody who works in the developing world where, you can't do anything informal, et cetera, Uber or some of those ride-sharing services were operating informally without regulatory recognition for a long period of time, but they ultimately did get that. So, that's really important. So the short-term success was they were able in the process, and don't have time to go into a lot of the politics, but I'll have a few anecdotes. They were able to basically transform regulatory structures to legalize and enable the expansion of Uber. And that happened in 2013, and since that, then we can't look back. No place in the world can look back. What we'll study and what's in the kind of part of the narrative, hopefully if you take a look at the cases, you'll enjoy them, is really the give and take, the political give and take. Why Mayor Lee at that time responded to Travis Kalanick and other sets of, it wasn't just him, Lyft, there were all sorts of ride-sharing services. There were many ride-sharing services. And part of the argument was Lee was really, even though he was a Democrat, he wasn't really, and I'm jumping ahead a little bit to the punchline, this is a private sector innovation. This was not a government innovation, but it could not be successful without the government signing on to the project. So why did Lee work with Kalanick? And we go into a lot of details about the kind of poor service of taxis. So there were not good enough alternatives for Lee not to be able to consider this, and very successful arguments were made with data that the ride-sharing companies were coming to the city with, et cetera. But also, Lee had identified himself as a mayor of a city that is going to be leader in high tech. And this is a part of the political bargain. But he knew it was going to be very problematic with a lot of the traditional Democratic Party base, forget even just the kind of the taxi medallion owners, et cetera. So what he did was he basically jumped upstairs a level of governance to the state of California, the conversation about regulatory change. So he basically avoided a political problem at the scale at which he wanted to introduce Uber. Of course, the regulation is for all of the state of California, but he was able to do that because of that political anticipating the opposition and pushing it upstairs. Obviously, the long-term impacts of the smart mobility transition, I would just say, are to kind of change every city's conversation in the United States and around the world. So we know that. But I do think that there was an unrealized institutional coordination that limited the achievement of larger urban sustainability goals. And part of that was because the mayor jumped the decision up to the regulatory scale at the state and never really, and maybe Tim, you will have something, you probably have other stories, but it wasn't really discussed deeply within the kind of people in the city government in San Francisco as fitting in, coordinating with, having something to do with their existent mobility goals. It wasn't really incorporated into the rough give and take about transportation planning, which takes a long time. Maybe the time expedience was part of that. So anyway, it was successful. He got it done. I compared that in this slide just because I want us to think about the smart mobility transition with the congestion charging in Stockholm, which is not a totally new idea anymore. They had it in London first. But what was really interesting to us in the Stockholm case was that the mayor, well, first of all, congestion charging was talked about for about 15 years, if not longer, in Stockholm. And it took a really long time for it to get done. So I think that's a really important lesson. I'll come back to that on my last slide. But the second thing that was super interesting about this case, and that I think is important for us to understand, is the mayor who actually introduced congestion charging had campaigned for the mayor of Stockholm on a platform opposing congestion charging. But she was in the Social Democratic Party, and when she was elected, the Social Democrats, who were also elected on the national level, got elected in alliance with the Green Party. And they said, this has to happen. Because this is about sustainability, and you're the same political party, we have to push for sustainability. Even though politically she knew it was very problematic because the kind of demographics of Stockholm were different, and it was the kind of wealthier suburbs. They didn't want congestion charging because they were driving in from the wealthy suburbs. So she was able to do this in part by having a pilot. She had a referendum. She had this, after she did a pilot, she had citizens vote on the congestion charging, and she won. And then she lost, and the next election was kind of sad. And the conservative government that had campaigned against it institutionalized it. So there was an institutionalization. It's a super interesting political story, which we don't have time to go into. They had their short-term policy success. But the question becomes, what is the long-term impact of that? I think it's important to recognize, and this came up this morning, that an innovation that brings revenues back to the government helps lay the groundwork for expanding administrative and political capacity. And that was my earlier slide. If you want to lay the groundwork for long-term change, you have to expand governance capacity. It doesn't always have to be expanded by money, but money helps a lot. And we've had a lot of conversations today already about, well, who's paying for it and where's the money? Sometimes those are difficult things. The people in the suburbs of Stockholm didn't want to pay more, but they ultimately paid more because it reduced congestion. And they decided the extra $2 or $3 that they spent was better because there was less congestion where they're going. So the congestion charging process pulled through, brought in some revenues. The other important thing about congestion charging, there was a huge debate in Stockholm about what to call it. They actually called it a congestion tax, which is very difficult. Charging sounds very benign. If we did it in the United States, we called one of these monitoring systems a congestion tax. No politician would be able to introduce it. But in the Stockholm case, because it was considered, the opposition called it a tax, they pushed their debate up to the level of the nation, and it was understood to be a congestion tax that was drawn at the scale of Stockholm from cars coming into the city of Stockholm, but the revenues went back to the national government and they distributed in transit-oriented development across the region. And I think that's a super powerful way of thinking about sustainability, not keeping the kind of benefits at the local level. So I guess what I want to say here is, I've got like a 1 minute or something like that, but like the kind of point is that it's the implementation process that makes a difference to long-term capacity building. Both of these cases, policy success, but they had very different implementation processes. The ride sourcing firms, and that just summarizes them, but the bottom line is a depoliticized, closed, narrow, and technical nature of policy deliberation in a small group of people discussing. They knew a lot about the area, but it was never in a big public forum or public agenda. Whereas in Stockholm, that there was a long debate over about 10 or 15 years. There was a lot of political contention. The mayor got dragged through the mud. She had opposition. There were newspaper articles, and then they did the pilot and the trial, etc. But it was an open, wide, contentious, wide-ranging policy debate and co-production across multiple scales of government sector, opposite of what happened in San Francisco. And again, the territorial scales created not only a consciousness, but institutional, political, as well as financial capacity to move sustainability agenda forward. So this is just a summary. That's just a summary of what I've ended up saying. So policy success in San Francisco, but policy success and enhanced institutional commitments and capacity in Stockholm. So just 2 more slides. I wanted to say a little something about equity. We didn't look at equity so much, and I think the big elephant in the room about this is like the success of the congestion charging in Stockholm just raised property values. And that kind of raises questions about whether whether you could, if you don't control if the party in power on the national level is making decisions about where to spend that money that comes from the congestion tax, doesn't spend it on sustainability, and doesn't spend it on issues about kind of displacement in Stockholm, there are going to be more equity questions. People weren't really looking at equity questions as much as I think they should have in the beginning because they were really struggling over changing the discourse about congestion charging. And I think, not that I'm saying equity questions should ever be second, but sometimes if you want to create, if you're thinking about the strategies and tactics, sometimes you have to understand, you have to get people happy behind an idea before you then start asking questions. Okay, if we're going to continue with these types of strategies, what do they say about equity? I guess I want to say that conflict is good. That's a key takeaway. And if you're in the sustainability business, you're in it for the long haul anyway. That's what planning is. Planning is always bumpy and contentious and in it for the long haul. And that's why planners do not hold the answer, because we are just kind of the mediators in political processes. But if you bring the right number of people together, wide ranges of stakeholders across different constituencies and territorial kind of scales, you might be able to lay the groundwork for transformative change. Thanks. Oh, will there be?
Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much. So you were talking about, we didn't really talk so much about equitability or equity. So I was wondering if you could just name, like, specifically what would be the foundation or principles that equity or sustainable equity or equity and sustainability should be based on. Thank you.
Are we gathering or should I try that?
Any other questions? Do we want to take one or two more? Anna?
Hi. So as you know, Connecticut is trying to add tolls to the highways. And one of the ways that they're trying to reframe this based on revenue raising rather than congestion, reducing congestion. So my question for you is, how, if you were advising the governor, what would your strategy be to sort of, either political message or how he needs to approach this problem? Because there's a huge opposition, which is expected when these kind of things happen. And right now, I think it's probably stuck because it hasn't gone through during the last session. So.
I have a very quick question. So your case studies in Stockholm and San Francisco, there's already transport systems in place, there's locked-in behavior. So the lessons learned here, how applicable would they be for places where the infrastructure, especially the transport infrastructure, is not locked in?
Okay, I think I'll start with your point first, and maybe that links me to the kind of equity framing, and Karen's last. But I actually think it's a very smart strategy to talk about it as revenue generation, which is kind of what happened in the Stockholm case with the discussion about whether it's going to be called a tax or a charge or something like that. That doesn't get you everywhere, right? But at least it starts making the public think about what's being gained by this change as opposed to what's being lost, like their freedom to kind of, or their pocketbook, concerns if they have to drive their kids to school and they need to be on the car and they can't rely on public transport. So I think, but obviously in every political context, there are other sets of things that have to get brought into it. So maybe it needs to be brought more locally to the Connecticut place. What are the other hot issues that you might be able to get a wide range of people to support you for these types of changes? Now that leads me a little bit to the equity, because one of the other things, and this is a bit of my critique, and I'll come back to it with the kind of systems in San Francisco and Stockholm, is that I think one of the things that we learned, and one of my criteria of like transformative capacity, is a land use transit nexus. I think anybody who's trying to make an innovation in transportation without thinking about land use is not going to address the equity question, And that also it could be very problematic, but that is also something that might be used in the Connecticut case. How do you think about these revenues, whether you call it investment in transit-oriented development, whether you call you could say these revenues will go for other transit and mobility, but for most car drivers who are serious car drivers, they could care less if any more money is going in the public system. So that's not going to be a framing that's going to help them. But if there's a way to link investment in housing with investment in a public transportation system, you might be able to kind of widen your capacity to get more people behind it. And that really deals with the equity issue. And at our table last night, we were talking about that. This is true also in Stockholm. Stockholm, the cost of housing is going through the roof like every very successful city in Europe. Stockholm is constrained geographically. You've got to go, I mean, the way they could do congestion charging is they have bridges that go into the center of the city. So it's technically very easy to charge people because there are only 3 or 4 places to come into the city. This is a problem for most cities. Where do you charge? So it could work, you know, in London, et cetera, but you have to be kind of a geographically constrained city. So back to so getting congestion charging and linking it to was easy in Stockholm. They linked it to a very good, robust transportation system, but it didn't deal with all the equity questions as much as it could have. And I think right now the debate is whether they will spend more of that money, not just on transport, but on housing, especially in the periphery. And Stockholm has now immigrant populations which have problematized the issue of social housing. So that may be a barrier to talk about, linking the two. And that gets me back then, Karen, to your question. I think the problem, one of my critiques of the Uber in the case, and so it's not a general Uber, I've taken it once or twice myself, although it took me a really long time to take it. Actually, I'm a Lyft person, but that I think that the lack of conversation in San Francisco about the impact of those innovations, even the impact of like Google and other big IT firms offering their own public transportation, and like what is the city is paying for all the infrastructure, and there's no revenue sharing at all. So private firms are making all the money off this public problem. So, and because there wasn't a really deep discussion about how to connect those private services with the infrastructural system, either politically, socially, in terms of routes or whatever, they lost an opportunity. Now, I'm the first to admit that cities that are now thinking about ride sharing and that want to invest in public transport are really thinking, and this is where smart technology comes in. How do you connect up the last mile? How do you really embrace innovation that allows you to support the existing system? So even though those cities had those existent systems, the mobility situation is not that much better than some of the other cities that we look at. Last thing I would say is those strategies and tactics were available every place. I'm not saying every place is going to do congestion charging or follow kind of the embrace of the regulatory changes. A lot of cities actually are pushing back against those regulatory changes. But I do think that we don't have to always look for the model and the policy. That's my point. You want to look for the models in the process, in the politics of it, when you're going to a city with a different political system, with a different transit system. I can just say one more thing on that, if I know we have to end, but about the Mexico City case. They fought 12 years to get like 20 kilometers of bus rapid transit. They have 12 subway lines. And there is some effort to connect the BRT to the subway lines, but it's not. And so you would say that's a very advanced system. It does nothing for a metropolitan area of 20 million people, where those lines are structured around industrial development and firm location from 30 years ago. So I guess I'm saying that just because you might have an advanced infrastructure already in place doesn't mean that you're ahead of the game. You might even be behind the game.
Please help me thank Diane and all the speakers for the day, and thank you all for coming.